Morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Mabato Monze, and I will be moderating the conversation this morning. Thank you once again for being with us. I'm just going to go through our agenda session and introduce our panelists to you. Please feel free to chat with us in the chat box as we have this conversation. Melissa, can you please just put up our agenda on the screen so that we can share it with our participants? Our session today aims to focus on three themes around threats to democracy. I think it's a very important question, to ask, to say, how much is technology affecting democracy? Is technology really a big threat to democracy? If so, what is it that we can do as ordinary civilians? How can we empower ourselves? How do we ensure that we can use technology to advance democracy in Africa particularly? So we will be talking about media suppression. We have seen around the continent how different governments have used the internet, or rather have tried to control access to the internet when the people are not happy. What are digital rights? How do we ensure that those are kept in check? What recourse for citizens? Is the tech and the power that it possesses are concentrated in the hands of a few? So those are the type of questions that we will be asking today. I'm going to introduce our speakers for this particular session. You can also find more information on our website. I'm going to pop in the link onto the chat so that in your time, when you would like to know a bit more about them, you can do that. Nati will also be helping us in terms of our social media. You can engage with us on Twitter and Facebook. And please remember to pose your questions in our Q&A section as well. So we have Pria. Pria is the regional director at ENCODE. She has more than 12 years experience in technology, law, and policy. She has worked with 4 various organizations such as PwC, and she's done a lot of work. She's also sat on various boards such as the BRICS Cybercities Expert Group. Please do feel free to read up more about Pria on the website. And then we have Hlengiwe, who is a project coordinator at Democracy, Transparency and Digital Rights Unit. She's also currently a PhD candidate with the University of Pretoria. She's also done quite a lot of work around democracy in Africa through her work at the Center for Human Rights. And we will be showcasing Gbenga's film as well. He is executive director of Paradigm Initiative, a Pan-African social enterprise working on digital inclusion and digital rights. They have got various offices, on the continent in Cameroon, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Thank you very much for joining us, guys. We really appreciate your presence as we have this very important conversation. Just as an icebreaker, we would like you to share with us this morning how you would describe yourself using a fruit. You can just pop that in the chat group. So using a fruit, what would you describe yourself as? I'll describe myself as a pineapple because I've been eating pineapple the entire week. So I would be a pineapple. So just for, you know, the fun of it, please pop into the chat how you would describe yourself this morning using a fruit. We've got tomato, mango. Yeah, so we'll just go through them as we continue the conversation. Okay, now that we have all the formalities out of the way, we are going to start with our conversation. And in doing that, I think it is probably best that we ask, what do we mean when we talk about threats to democracy? What does, because democracy and also taking into consideration technology, these are very big things, and they're growing, they're very topical at the moment. So how do we define threats to democracy? What are they? What do they mean for us as citizens of the African continent in particular? Pria, perhaps you would like to give that a go.
Thank you very much. And let me start by thanking the Civic Tech Innovation Network for this collaboration, but also for today's event. I think it does come at a time when you know, we have been saturated with conversations over the year, and this is yet another important conversation that we need to have, taking some of these issues and placing it within that discourse of democracy and taking the conversation further. So first, my thanks for the collaboration and the initiative and bringing us together. In terms of the importance of the issue, I think, and giving us a kind of starting block, I think what I wanted to focus on today is some of the access to information issues, the way that we see them. And increasingly over the years, I think what I've seen is that there's been a kind of misinterpretation in the space of democracy and understanding the role of access to information laws. And so what I want to put out is almost a hypothesis to get us going, which is that, are we really seeing the potential of access to information laws in today's digital age? And if it's not living up to its potential, if there is more that we can do to improve transparency and access to the interrelated digital rights ecosystem, how do we revision access to information laws on the continent? One, to improve access to democracy, but also to strengthen just the human rights and digital rights ecosystem within the digital era that we find ourselves. So that's something that I just want to put out. There's so much potential, and there's some, I think, exciting and visionary work to be done to give life to a kind of new data law on the basis of the access to information laws.
Fantastic. That access is really an important issue on its own. I was actually reflecting on how I think in our efforts, you know, to have access to technology or use technology, you know, to share current affairs and so on, everybody is now moving to things like podcasts. Data costs are very high. Are people in the rural areas where technology or access to technology is not that great? What are we then saying about them? Because everybody is moving away from community radio stations, which is another way we could ensure that people are being included in conversations, that people know what is going on. So in technology moving on so rapidly, are we then not leaving others behind who are not in urban areas? I don't think we are giving much thought to that. Hlengiwe, your thoughts just on what threats to democracy actually mean? Hlengiwe?
I was just unmuting myself. So thank you very much to the organizers for this opportunity and organizing this very important webinar where we are discussing issues around threats to democracy. And I don't know if you want me to get into detail about the examples.
Not necessarily yet. I think just, to give an indication of, your thoughts around what threats to democracy is or are, as an introduction to the topic.
Okay, thank you so much. First and foremost, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we are having this conversation during a time when we are observing the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And as digital rights activists, I think it's very important, again, to bring the conversation that gendered angle and look at how, the using the online space or the cyberspace is also the violence against women is manifesting in that space. So I just thought, as we are having this conversation, we really have to reflect on violence against women and commemorate the 16 days with that in mind. But I just want to mention that the threats to democracy in Africa are real. It's happening, and the democratic space, as we have always been saying about the shrinking of the space, it doesn't get any better. We are seeing a lot that is happening, a lot of undoing of some of the positives or some of the gains that we have managed to amass over the years. And the coming of the digital age as well is bringing in novel threats, or is exacerbating some of the existing threats that we had. And I like the point that Pria mentions of access to information. In this day and age, we're still grappling with issues around access to information. We're still grappling with issues around transparency. We're still grappling with issues around accountability. And I think those are very important points to consider when you're looking at threats to democracy on the continent. Thank you.
Fantastic. Speaking about gender-based violence, an issue that is occurring or that is becoming very prevalent is how technology is used to facilitate or to enable gender-based violence, and how technology is also used to as a tool to surveil women's bodies or women in general. So technology does definitely have a lot to offer us, but we need to be very careful of how we use these tools and consider how we are going to hold people accountable, in this space. We are actually wanting to run a poll around this now that we have an understanding of what threats to democracy actually mean, and how technology is either making it worse and advancing democracy, or whether we are actually digressing. So the question is, in the next 10 years, do you see the world as getting better or worse through tech? Please participate in our poll, because I think it would give a great indication of what our thoughts in general are around this topic. You will see the pop-up on your screen. Please just choose your answer, yes or no, or yes and no, and submit. Okay. Another question that we thought would be useful to ask is a lot of things have happened in 2020. I think we have seen how COVID has brought to the fore issues of inequality throughout the continent. And we just really want to ask if there are any specific threats to democracies that you've noted in 2020, on the continent, and could you give us some examples that speak to this issue?
Butter, do you want us to put those on the chat or?
No, Hlengiwe and Pria can help us with those examples that they can think of at the present moment around 2020, you know, and how technology has really affected us. But I mean, our participants are more than welcome to just also be in conversation with us. We will go through some of your responses on the chat. I see Caroline Khene has already said it's a governance and ethics of the tech issue that will determine yes or no, referring to our poll. But it would be great, Priya and Hlengiwe, if we can just have, you know, insights around what do you think those examples from 2020 would be.
Well, I mean, let me start out by saying that, you know, the digital innovation that we've seen over the last few years has really been useful in 2020. So, you know, we saw a number of collaborative initiatives, we saw some public and private sector partnerships and so on. And what we saw was this willingness that we've been working very hard for a very long time to take technologies that were seen as experimental or that were, you know, where there was a reluctance in previous years to innovate at the policy level, to permit certain technology usage or to collaborate and partner. What we saw in 2020 was almost a seamless approach to that collaboration and letting the digital innovation do what it's supposed to do to help solve problems and have access to certain critical information and so on. But a few things also came into the spotlight. The first is obviously the right to health, you know, and interpreting what that means and interpreting what that means given its relationship with other rights. And in the context of that, we saw some implications on the right to privacy, for instance. And Hlengiwe's team and the center have done incredible work just in a very short space of time to unpack within the continent what some of the implications are on the right to privacy. But from from our observations, what we also saw was that the definitions that we have for the right to privacy, the scope and the content of it and what it means in practice was also tested. And the limitations that we envisaged and imagined, we also had to give life to that and see where the barriers are and how do we, when faced with crisis, apply the right to privacy. So that's one. The other is then, protection from surveillance. So we found ourselves in this catch-22 where we are vulnerable and where we need, our information to fall into the right hands so that we can have access to the kind of information that can be life-saving. And as part of that, we opened our minds to certain surveillance that we didn't do before. So I think there are some very interesting questions coming out in terms of surveillance and also the tensions between privacy and surveillance. And then, of course, I think, again, for me, I'm going to sound a little obsessed with access to information, but something that we've been particularly interested in is does the spectrum of role players, such as in civil society, in small and medium enterprises, and at the various innovation levels that one would observe, did this spectrum of players and actors have access to the information that they needed over 2020 to be useful and to be of service during the pandemic? And by this, I mean why, we're asking questions about the restrictions that were placed on the contact tracing information and on the databases that governments have put together. And so something for us to think about beyond 2020 is then who is that, set of actors and role players in such a crisis? who would need access to information, and how do we make sure that at the drop of a hat, when we find ourselves in such a crisis in the future, that we have all the access to information mechanisms that we need for almost instantaneous, seamless, integrous access to information.
Thank you very much for that, Pria. Hlengiwe, your thoughts around this?
Thank you. I just want to also add on to the point that Pria is making around access to information. Just to reflect on the status of access to information on the continent, you realize that in terms of adoption of legislative frameworks, across the whole African continent, we have less than half of the African continent population, with less than half of the African countries with access to information laws. And that is very worrying. So what it basically means is that there is not really a creation of that environment that promotes access to information. But we also want to acknowledge the work that has been done by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, in that it has developed certain standards that can be used for guidance by states in developing such frameworks that are necessary to promote access to information, particularly proactive disclosure. So I just want to mention the presence of a model law that was adopted by the African Commission in 2013. It's a guidance for states to develop their framework. And recently, the African Commission adopted guidelines on access to information, specifically focusing on the electoral environment. And then last year, the African Commission also adopted the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, which encapsulates those salient principles that are significant in an access to information regime. So, but at the moment, as the situation pertains on the continent, access to information is still a challenge. As I've mentioned, the status of adoption of laws. But even those countries that have the laws that are in place, the challenge of implementation again, the implementation of those laws is very low. You find there are countries such as Liberia, such as Malawi, with very elaborate laws, but the level of implementation is quite low, and issues around transparency and governance, when an access to information regime is weak, they are also affected. And I just want to also reflect on something that we are witnessing on the continent, with an example of Zimbabwe. The protection of whistleblowers. Whistleblower protection is part of the access to information regime, and is also one of the ways of strengthening democracy. When the environment, when whistleblowers are not protected, we see what is happening in Zimbabwe with the arrest of the journalist Hopewell Chinono. He has been arrested, twice now, and it revolves around how he has been exposing corruption. And this is in an environment where there is no whistleblower protection or disregard of whistleblowers, and we are seeing a continuation of the protection or the empowerment of the already empowered, or the protection of those that are in power. So that is also the lack of a whistleblower protection, an effective whistleblower protection framework is under threat, really. Not only this does not happen only in Zimbabwe, but this is something that is happening in other countries, that those that have information that is in the public interest, exposing issues around wrongdoing, like corruption, that are in the public interest, is becoming very scary, because the consequences are very costly. And so I wanted to reflect on that. And also generally, there is a threat, the media freedom threat across the continent. We are seeing these things happening in Uganda, in Egypt, arrests of journalists on the line of duty. If you look at the situation in Cameroon, if you look at the situation in Nigeria, it's, across the continent, the, media freedom is under threat. The right of freedom of expression generally is under threat on the continent, despite that, you know, our international frameworks define freedom of expression as a fundamental right and also an important right with regards to access to information. If freedom of expression or media freedom is under threat, it means the right of access to information is also severely undermined. And also related to media freedom, freedom of expression and access to information, I just want to point out the issue of access to internet on the continent, that, you know, there's, you know, digital exclusion or digital divide is real. We are witnessing. Unfortunately, it has taken a pandemic to wake us up as a continent to realize the importance of access to information. And we haven't really begun to think about making access to internet a fundamental right, a decision that we see, you know, in the courts in India, you know, the courts pronouncing themselves on access to internet. But when it comes to the African continent, you know, viewing access to internet as a fundamental right, we are still very far from that. Such that when COVID-19 hit us, those of us that are digitally connected, we have managed to slide into the digital realm and continue with our work seamlessly. We have continued with our meetings, we have continued with a lot of activities. But think of the billions of people or millions of people on the African continent that have no access to internet, that will never know that we are having this conversation that we are having today, that will not be able to contribute to these very conversations that we are having today. And that is really a challenge that COVID-19 has taught us. Access to internet is not just a privilege, but it is indeed a right. And as I am also continuing to reflect on issues of gender-based violence, I just want to say that this is not just, you know, talk about violence against women. It has an impact on women's participation in the democratic space. When women are violated online, when, you know, they face, you know, issues such as cyberbullying, you know, there's trolling, doxing, hate speech, sharing, non-consensual sharing of intimate images, that has profound impacts on the way and the manner in which women are able to participate in the democratic space. It can actually, such violence can actually create a space where, you know, the internet is, you know, that space that is perceived as dangerous for women because of the, you know, the unfriendliness or the manner in which society tends to react when you use the internet space to state your certain positions. So I think it's very critical because women, you know, we are talking about women that are politicians. We are talking of women that are gender activists. We are talking of women that are sexual minority activists. We are talking of ordinary women. We are talking of women in certain, in different positions, and they need to use the internet space like everybody else, but it's not a safe space every time they want to use it. There are certain harms that are associated with being in the cyberspace. And I also just want to mention the issue of the proliferation of repressive laws that we are seeing on the continent being adopted and being a threat to democracy. Cyber crime laws, our governments are taking advantage of, you know, the existence of cyber crime and, you know, regulation of cyber crime to also craft the laws in such a manner that, you know, they impact negatively on fundamental rights such as freedom of expression. For example, the case of Tanzania's cybercrime laws, it has very profound negative impacts on freedom of expression, and also it has the capacity of even, you know, silencing the media and silencing journalists. And those laws, we are seeing that the laws on there are laws on misinformation, laws on fake news, just to use that term. So we have this proliferation of laws that, you know, are repressive and having an impact on human rights and curtailing, you know, and shrinking further the democratic space. I think I just want to stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. In fact, last night as I was just going through various websites in trying to prepare for this, I realized that in some countries, governments would actually go as far as going onto social media platforms to look at key participants in demonstrations and, you know, using social media to identify these people in an effort to obviously silence them. So for me, that was a very interesting issue, you know, that I came across to say, oh wow, some governments really do go through to extremes to try and actually silence ordinary civilians from demonstrating, from you know, communicating their discontent, and so on. We will be moving to our next section of the webinar. In doing so, I'd like to invite Gbenga to give us a bit of an overview around the work that he does, and to also share his film. And I'm gonna laugh because my colleagues and I had a bit of a private joke about the pronunciation of film, and they're saying, no, it's a silent L, and I'm like, no, I'm not British, I'm not English, so it's film. That's how we used to call it, you know, growing up, film. So Gbenga will be sharing a bit of information about his film and take us through to the next session of our conversation. The stage is yours, Gbenga.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to talk about a film. And it's interesting. You know what? You're in charge. Whatever you say it is today is what it is. That's what we call it. It's great to be here, and just also thank Jesse again for inviting me, you know, to join you. So before you see the short film, let me tell you, you know, how we got there. In 2007, we started, you know, I started a Paradigm Initiative just to, you know, mind my business and train young people so that they can get better opportunities and things like that. But as you know, as Africans, you can't just mind your business. Things just happen and you have to pay attention to them. And then we realized that we had to do some work in policy, because no matter how much we train these young people, they will go into an environment where if the policy is wrong, you know, as we heard a few minutes ago, there are countries where not only do governments check what's going on online to monitor who's protesting. In Nigeria, where there have been recent protests, people who were protesting actually had their bank accounts blocked, and they were accused of terrorism. You know, that is how scared, you know, governments can be. I'm not just across the continent, in, you know, in other places. You've seen the meltdown of the soon-to-be ex-president of the United States, Donald Trump, you know, on Twitter. That is the thinking of many people who hold power. They can't relate with anyone challenging them. And so when we started working on policy, we soon realized very quickly, you know, at about 2013, that it was serious business, that many governments across the continent were investing heavily in surveillance equipment for security. One of the countries we work in, we realized that the government had invested, even though the government said they didn't have money, but had invested $40 million US dollars in surveillance equipment to an Israel-based company called Urbit Systems. You know, we challenged that in court. Even though we lost the case, we continue to challenge such regimes. We continue to provide information. We continue to train, you know, different people in the media, in civil society, you know, and other members of, you know, of non-governmental institutions in particular, to basically say that the price to pay for liberty, you know, as we say, you know, the price to pay for us to continue to have liberty is continued vigilance. Vigilance is the price we pay for liberty. We have to pay attention. So Paradigm Initiative now works in digital rights and digital inclusion. And in 2016, we realized that it was important for us to capture the details so that when we have conversations, you know, either we go to court or we have advocacy, you know, conversations with government, we don't want to say we think you are violating rights in your country. We want to say, you violate rights in your country. This is what you did in 2017. This is what you did in 2018. So building on two reports I'd written in 2014 and 2015 for Nigeria, we started writing a report for the continent in 2016. We started with about, I think, 8 countries. This year, we're going to focus on 20 countries. Last year was 13 countries. And what we basically did was in 2017, we made it bilingual so they can be in English and in French. And the report focuses on 3 things. Number 1, what happened in digital rights in that year we're reporting. Number 2, what were the things that the various institutions did to make sure that they fought back to demand their rights? And number 3, what is the trend in each country and across the continent? So in 2019, we did this report for 13 countries. We decided that, you know what, many times when you send 78-page reports to people, they don't read them. If I run a poll here now to ask how many of us don't have a PhD behind our names, but read 78-page reports, you'll probably, get an interesting response. So we decided to, and this is also something we need to learn as people who work in digital rights and as advocates, we need to communicate in ways people understand. Jargon is good for us as a silo, but to communicate across silos, you may need to break down the jargon. So we decided to do a short film. We're so excited. We've got very interesting partners at Paradigm Initiative. One of our partners was willing to take the risk, to take a gamble, to invest a lot of money into making a short film on digital rights. I mean, who makes films on these things? Many people have made films about, various subjects. And so we told them, we believe that if we tell the story, people will be interested in seeing the story. And when people enjoy movies, Nigerian movies are very popular across the continent. So let's take advantage of that, release something popular, and let's see, what has happened. What you're about to see now is based on the 2019 Digital Rights in Africa report that we released in early 2020 and has now been converted into a 18-minute short film. And I understand you will see 7 minutes of it, and I've deliberately chosen the 7 minutes that will give you all the information you need to know about the short film, but I will leave you asking an important question about what happened at the end so that you can watch. So Paradigm Initiative is excited to work on digital rights and digital inclusion across the continent. And we look forward to working with various organizations who are on this call because the work that we will need to do will increase as access increases. Don't forget this, and this is my last point. As access increases on the continent, more people will use access because they're connected to the internet. They will ask questions of governments. Governments will get more worried, and governments will want to clamp down more. Right now, we have internet users that are way less, on the average on the continent is less than 20%. And when it gets to 40%, there will be twice the noise, twice the questions, and twice the criticism of government. And don't forget, with every criticism comes hardliners who say, who are these young people speaking against us? Let's clamp down on them. Let's invest more in security, and let's shut them up so that we can perpetuate ourselves in power and stay on for, even when we're 80 or 90, we can still be presidents of our countries and maybe even hand over to our children who will continue to do all this. So I invite you to enjoy what will be the 7-minute moment in the short film, and I'm more than happy to speak very quickly to what you've seen again after you see it. And if there are questions either about subjects identified in the short film or basically about our work generally, either in Cameroon, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, or even in Tanzania or any other country, I'll be more than happy to speak to them. Thank you, Madam Moderator. I have spoken about a film, and I guess we can now watch it.
Sir, I've been wanting to ask you a few questions about this office. People must know what you do here, right? All over Africa. You say you're in countries, right? So how come no one is saying anything?
Pass me your phone. have Twitter, right?
Yes.
Can I use your phone for a minute? How many retweets does this have?
350,000. So.
Now let me find that idiot that's always insulting the president. And how many does this one have?
41 retweets, sir.
Eat your food, Jude, my friend. Nobody cares. Eat your food. Jude, the only time the office would be worried is if all these countries where we operate in actually come together to compare notes and talk. But this is Africa. We both know that will never happen. Come with me. Now, if we're talking sheer numbers and scale, this is my favorite department. Egypt, 2019. Remember Abd al-Fattah? Wouldn't keep his mouth shut, so we acquired him. That's this, guys. Mary, Halima, Thomas, and Thomas. Don't mix them up. Jude, if you need a problem, all problems to disappear, these are the guys to talk to. They deployed their contacts across Africa so effectively. Jude, shall we? Come on. Jude, you know, when the company pays you well, it never stops harassing. Timesheets. Ready for the last room? So come on then, let's go. You want to hear something ironic? Terrorism has furthered our cause more than anything in the last few years. Now, governments can increase their budget in order to fund the operations they need. No questions asked.
Keeping the citizens safe.
That's right. In Nigeria, the government invests heavily in this kind of equipment. Think of it as a build-up to bigger things to come. Jude, come. Well, that's it. That's our little operation here. It's a thankless job, but we do it. Plus, I can tell you that we pay people well to keep them happy. I mean, benefits, bonuses, your insurance.
I really have to.
I like you, Jude. I really do. You're young, smart, and you think deep, I can tell. You know, it's people like you we need to pass the baton to. You gave me a good vibe today, so I am going to give you an opportunity. But first, we have a little tradition around here. Think of it like an induction. Go on. Gaining information under pressure against a ticking clock has always been a true test of grit and a willingness to improvise. There is an office bet on how fast you can get a series of names from our friend in there. Now, the office record is 7 minutes, but I put my money on you to split that in half. Was I wrong? Was I wrong? No, sir. I can do it. Welcome to the team, Jude.
Wow, that was a powerful extract from your film. Please, continue to tell us more about it.
So I think the first thing you will notice here is many times we don't think as the of the people in government who actually get this work done as people like us. Many of them do it for different reasons. As you could see with Jude, he actually interviewed for a role, and he was attracted because of many things, also one of which was power. You could see the various departments where work, is being done. Surveillance, for example. What we've tried to do is to tell the story of the various subjects, data privacy violations, surveillance, even Muslim public opinion and protests. And one of the things that you would have heard Jude being told earlier is that people don't care. And I think if you don't get anything from this film, when you do get a chance to watch everything, ask yourself this question: how much do we care, and how much work are we willing to put in to make sure that our digital rights, that our dignity as citizens are protected? And this is really important because it then informs what we do, because the people who work 24/7 to abuse these rights have the resources, the manpower, woman power, and everything they need to do the work. As you heard there, terrorism has been good business for many governments. It's been good business. If you want to ask questions, the Nigerian government recently, a few years ago, asked questions about the military expenditure, but it died the moment that Boko Haram was mentioned. Who wants to question how much you spend fighting terrorists? I remember one of the meetings I was pulled into with the National Security Advisor in Nigeria. And after I made my presentation, the question I was asked was, are you friends with terrorists? Because that is the language they understand. The language is, you're either with us or with the terrorists. And they use that a lot, to propagate a lot of activities that we can't question. But I think the important thing is that as citizens, as organizations that work in this space, we cannot afford to outsource action to just a few people, because the fewer people that do this work, the easier it is to target them. My friend in Zimbabwe, my friends in Tanzania and Zimbabwe, who now share the same interesting position with their governments, their passports have been seized, and they can't travel. What have they done against the government? Nothing. It's so funny that the situation in Tanzania is such that my friend was being questioned for his authentic Tanzanianism or Tanzanianness. Because the government element said Tanzanians don't do this thing you're doing. Tanzanians don't ask questions like this. That's not true, but we need to make sure that more people are asking questions, more people are pushing back. When you hear there's going to be a bill on hate speech, check the draft, ask questions. Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Nigeria did the same thing at the same time, and you can see. My heart, and I'm sure many hearts here go out to Ethiopia at this moment with what's going on in the country. But unfortunately, the governments of these various countries take advantage of these situations to further deepen their investments. And I'll close by saying one of the things that I've since learned that can help us with our work. Even for those on the other side of this human rights divide, and I use that loosely, they will one day become victims again. And the platforms and systems they set up today will come to haunt them. Let me close with the story of the man I met with in 2014, who I met with his team. He was National Security Advisor in Nigeria. It was a powerful man. When his party lost elections in 2015, a few months later, he was fired, he was arrested, and he was sent to jail, and the case is still on. This man writes press statements now that read like what we write. He writes press statements asking for, his human rights to be respected and things like that. I even made a joke with my colleagues earlier in the day that we need to sue this Colonel Dasuki for plagiarism, because he's using the exact words that we used when he was responsible for many of the abuses. So we need to talk about not just the human rights in terms of dignity, not just the economic components, because every time the internet is shut down in any country, that country is losing money. And you can't really exactly shut down the internet completely. Anyone who knows about circumvention, which we teach, will tell you that, some of the things that you do, there are actually ways around them. Not only should we talk about, those losses, but we should also let people know that when you work in a security agency, when you work in government, the platforms you create today, the things that you're allowed to exist will be used against you when you become a member of the opposition. And I think the most important lesson to learn today is that we must all become digital rights advocates, because if we don't, then we will hear stories of others and we will feel sad for them. But one day, it may be your own story. I've had my fair share of brushes with security services in different countries. One of the East African countries, they almost seized my passport and tore my bag. And I know the way these things work. I suspected they could have planted something in my bag, so I refused to leave the room. The people who work against our rights are desperate. We need to become us, or maybe even more desperate, to maintain our rights.
Thank you so much, Gbenga, for that powerful screening of your film and the work that you do around these issues. Just to please reiterate what Ethan has posted on our chat group, he's created a document where we can, write our contact details. I think it's really important that us like-minded people who are part of various initiatives continue to, to get together, to broaden the network, to collaborate, to learn from each other, irrespective of our geographical locations. So please take the time to complete the spreadsheet on Google. He shared the link. I think it is really important that we continue to engage with each other and to broaden the network without making Ntate Terry Zilani feel as if though I'm ambushing him. I think it would be quite interesting to just have a short, comment from him about this particular topic. I don't think 10 years ago we would have even thought of technology as a potential threat to democracy. It is very interesting to see how rapidly tech has developed and the impact of tech on various parts of our lives. And with him having been the vice chairperson of the IEC for so long, I'm sure he has his own observations and insights around this topic. So if you wouldn't mind, Ntate Terry Zilani, to just perhaps a 1 minute, overview of your thoughts around this topic, please. Is he there? Oh no, I think maybe he got off the call. All right, well, we move on to the next part of our webinar, which is the panel discussion. Please feel free again to post your questions in the Q&A section so that we can have a very engaging conversation and to hear more from you. But I would like to start that conversation, and I mean, everybody from our panelists will be participating in this section to just really, clarify issues around fake news, misinformation and disinformation. We often use these words interchangeably. I recently learned that they're not the same thing. So to perhaps expand the conversation around some of these things, what is fake news? How do we know when fake news is being used to try and change our minds as ordinary citizens, or to prompt us to think around certain issues in a particular way? Please, if you can take the floor, Pria, Hlengiwe, Gbenga, your insights, please.
Thank you so much for that, Mabatu. I think before I touch on that question, I just wanted to respond and react to the film that we've just seen. I'm sure that for many of us, it's really caused us to just pause and really think about it. And I think what comes to mind, I mean, firstly, Gbenga, I think congratulations on just something that is excellent and provocative and gets us thinking. But it really does bring to mind that what we need, Gbenga made a call for digital rights advocates, but it really does make me think that what we do need is to encourage this broad set of people that are moving towards an understanding of how these issues that we're speaking about, and Hlengiwe mentioned it earlier, that we don't have nearly the kind of representation we would want in a discussion like this, but how we would want the larger population to be interacting with this issue and form part of how we think and solve and work through some of these issues. And I think what stood out for me from Gbenga's video is that perhaps we do need to be thinking about more multidisciplinary approaches to this. So combining, the power of arts and clearly policy research and advocacy excellence has really culminated in something that is quite powerful. And at the same time, I think we do need to conceptualize what a digital rights advocate and activist looks like in the future. Do they look like Hlengiwe? Do they look like Gbenga? Do they look like you, Mabato? Do they look like me? And you know, instead of staying within the kind of language that we speak in and the platforms that we use and so on, how do we make this a kind of transversal and pervasive thing if we think about digital rights activists being a more universal term? I think when it comes to the issues of fake news and misinformation, I think that the challenge that we have, and it was characterized a number of years ago, we saw this coming as the kind of content wars. We saw that over time, there will be a kind of coding approach to decide who gets attention and how we prioritize the information that we can consume. And what this has culminated in, it isn't as simple as saying that there is a group of actors who publish information that is false and is harmful in its falsity. I think we have to look at the bigger picture, because it is in fact us, it is in fact the audience that is participating in the so-called content wars and in the attention economy and deciding what takes precedence and what we see first and what we would like to consume. And so I know Hlengiwe will, expand on the human rights aspects of it, but what fascinates me is just how the technology has progressed to the point where the technology combined with human behavior presents this opportunity where there is a false reality in front of us, and this false reality has a number of harmful consequences. We might fall into, and I certainly won't put myself in that category, but we may fall into the category of people that can easily distinguish what is false and what is not. But when we contextualize this problem, we have to be able to see beyond that and see that in the broader population, that it is very difficult to do that. And there are economic consequences, there are socioeconomic consequences, and I would even go so far, at the risk of sounding radical, to say that what we could see is a complete deconstruction of democracy as we know it. But perhaps the scary part of it is that it isn't just the tech or a handful of actors. It is in fact humans that are driving the phenomenon.
Great. Hlengiwe, your thoughts?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pria, for those reflections. I just want to say that the issue of fake news, we are increasingly moving away from using that term, because the misconceptions around even lumping legitimate information or discrediting certain professions. So there are a lot of negative connotations around using the term fake news. So we would rather call it what it is. If it's disinformation, let's call it disinformation. If it's misinformation, let's call it misinformation. But I just want to say that really the concerns around misinformation and disinformation also, they are genuine. Just to mention, to give an example of COVID-19, we also, the World Health Organization bringing us a new term, the infodemic, because of a lot of incorrect information that was circulating around the pandemic and also when that information is spread and it reaches the wrong ears, it can have very disastrous repercussions. and the information or the misinformation and disinformation around COVID-19. We had information around the origins of the pandemic itself, and leading to hatred of Chinese or Asian people. There was information around treatment. There was information around prevention of COVID-19. So if that information, the way we are so gullible as human beings, and then you just take the information as it comes. And also, just to mention that, when we're looking at the issue of misinformation and disinformation in the African continent, is that, especially when you're looking at the digital context, it's happening at a time when digital literacy levels are very low. And, there is that lack of understanding of a lot of issues. And for some people, the only access to internet that they have is WhatsApp. And what comes through WhatsApp is truth. And what they receive through WhatsApp, they believe that is true. And, if information comes through your WhatsApp and it's about, treatment of COVID-19, and you feel like indebted to your friends or your family and your colleagues to share the information. So, there was that receiving and sharing information and forwarding as you receive, and it proliferates without any reflections on what you have received, without even thinking about, is this true? Can it be verified? And when we're asking people to confirm the truth of certain information, you are asking them to, if we are looking at it from the context of digital literacy, you're asking them something which is beyond their reach. We have COVID-19 hit us at a time when we are still very behind when it comes to digital literacy. That's when you're seeing that, people don't know really how to handle certain forms of information. And yet there is a lot of wrong information or misinformation that is spreading. So I think when we're looking at the subject of misinformation and disinformation, we have to look at it from the context of the broader context of access to information, the broader context of digital literacy itself, and also making the proper distinctions between what is disinformation and what is misinformation, and also taking a moment to also reflect on how our governments are reacting to misinformation and disinformation. And we have seen, really, as I have mentioned, that some of the laws that are being adopted, like cybercrime laws, are designed in such a way that they criminalize, what could be false information. And these are being abused, and they are not really properly regulated in such a manner that they protect freedom of expression, to the extent that, it impacts really on freedom of expression, and also criminalizing certain legitimate speech, because now, especially when you're looking at a context where there are heavy penalties associated with that. If you look at Zimbabwe, for example, the regulations on COVID-19, their statutory instrument had provisions on publication of false news, and the penalties were very harsh there. So that even silences people who intend to say, to release certain information about COVID-19, or the way the government or officials are handling the whole COVID-19 context. So, there's a whole lot of issues around false news, or whether you call it misinformation or disinformation. But I like the initiative that was adopted in South Africa by Media Monitoring Africa and its partners. It's called Drill 411, which is a digital initiative that has been set up to specifically deal with issues of misinformation and disinformation, where if you feel there is some information that is circulating and you feel like it falls within that category, it can be submitted to that platform for consideration. So I think that is a very worthy cause that can be emulated even beyond South Africa in other jurisdictions. And also, I think it's also important to prioritize issues around digital literacy and educate our communities and educate our people around, just how to handle information that we receive in our online platforms, our WhatsApp, our Twitter, our Facebook, about, the importance of verifying information. But again, as we are placing so much emphasis on issues of digital literacy and verifying information that we receive, we also have to be mindful of some of the constraints that are real, that our communities face. If you're asking somebody to be verifying information, looking at whether it has been published by, credible media, you're asking them to use data which they don't have. You're asking them to use a lot of data which they can't afford. So the cost of data is one reality in Africa. It's that is hindering a lot of issues around access to information, access to internet, and you find that most of the people, what they can afford is WhatsApp, but the ability to go beyond WhatsApp and verify information that they receive on WhatsApp, it's not there. Yeah, those are my points.
Yeah, that's a very important one to note. Prior to joining CTIN, I was of the view that Africans are just not doing enough to solve their own problems. But having been with CTIN for a couple of months now and being exposed to the various initiatives across the continent that people are involved in, I just don't think we are talking enough about some of these platforms and how they can really help get more civic participation. I think that is really where we are lacking. And I think by taking the issue of networks serious and having various platforms where we can share the initiatives, then it will help us boost, that access or speed the manner in which ordinary people get information, because there are a lot of initiatives out there. People are really doing a lot of good work that is just not being spoken about. Gbenga, your reflections on this particular one?
Yes, thanks. So I think it's really important to speak to the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And the clear difference between the two is intent, right? So with misinformation, it could be, that I received something from someone that I trust, that they don't even know to be true and that I'm sharing, but disinformation is deliberate. Disinformation is such that it's like propaganda. I want to deliberately mislead you to take certain actions. And when you look at the difference between these two, lawyers in the room will tell us that intent is extremely important. But even beyond all this, what I think, we have to pay attention to is the fact that, nobody disagrees that there is a problem with misinformation or disinformation or even with dangerous speech. We all agree on that. There are problems. Where we may differ is in terms of the approach to solving the problem. Governments are so quick to talk about regulations, but we know for a fact that when governments talk about regulations, they don't think of standards, they're thinking of control. And we also know that there are not many places in the world where regulation has actually solved the problem of misinformation, disinformation, or dangerous speech. In many cases, when you think you control or you limit or you censor, you create a black market for conversation. And that's even much worse, because if it's an open conversation, you can at least see what's going on and people can be reasoned with. But if that conversation moves off, where you can see it, where everyone can, appeal to senses and issues, then it becomes dangerous. But I think we have to pay attention to the weaponization of these alleged solutions. So in many cases, when we've reviewed, we've reviewed in Ethiopia, in Cameroon, in Tanzania, in Nigeria, we've reviewed all of the legislation, including Zimbabwe. All of this legislation proposed to solve those problems. They are very light on solving the problem, but very heavy on being vague enough for politicians to use to arrest opposition politicians or to shut them up. So basically, you hear things like it's in the interest of national security, but it's not national security. It is their own personal security, the security of their position as occupiers of the government seat. So I think that we have two assignments here, and it's okay to hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. Like we say around here, you can, I'm sure this has equivalent translation in many languages, that you can walk and chew gum at the same time, literally, right? Is that on one hand, we must make sure that we participate in solving these problems. Because if we leave solving the problems to government, there's only one language that some people understand. Security agencies only understand one language. Arrest them. Arrest that woman. That's the language many of them understand. Or buy more surveillance equipment, or invest more in security, or just seize their passports and things like that. So maybe if they can't travel, they will miss things and shut up. So we must participate. We must begin to think about it. In terms of, massive education of people. And I know it is, of course, like you said, it is very difficult to pass on the bulk to citizens and say, it is now your responsibility to verify if this information is correct or not, especially when it comes from trusted sources. But at the same time, we need to put government under pressure to proactively release information. And I say this because a lot of the misinformation out there is built on gaps. Because there are gaps in government communication. I'll give you very practical examples. Some president from a Central African country is seen at a hotel in Paris, and then somebody writes a story and says, oh, this guy lives here, he has a penthouse suite here. Is the story true or not? We don't know. You know why we don't know? Because the presidency has refused to explain why this old man is always seen at that hotel in Paris or in Geneva. If there was proactive disclosure to say, okay, we're doing some work with certain, members of our community in Geneva, and the meeting happened at Intercontinental, blah, 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 then we know why the president was there. But if we don't know why, or the president in Nigeria who was ill and flown abroad, and people were asking, is he alive or dead? And because somebody knows who I'm talking about, I'm just leaving gaps so that, if there's a lawsuit, I can have how to defend myself. The lawyers in the house will help me with that, plausible deniability. And the interesting thing is, in that scenario of the president being missing and nobody knowing where he is, all it took was for the presidency to release a statement to say, the president is sick. It's okay to be sick. I've been sick before, I'll be sick again. All of us on this call have experienced illness one time or the other. It is human. It is called a human body. But when we want to paint, because we're psychophants and want to paint our political leaders as machines, you almost always see pictures of presidents doing push-ups and not them in a weak position, and things like, if it was so bad that many of them didn't even wear masks because they thought it made them look weak, when indeed it actually makes you look strong, that you are empathic and care about other people. So I think on one hand, we have to participate in solving this problem, demand for proactive disclosure of information, also begin to see how our communities can imbibe, new codes of ethics that will definitely be able to make sure that when communities find information, and I said this, to a group yesterday, maybe Africa actually has a solution to this problem. In our communities, we say it takes a village to raise a child. There's a reason why we say that. We say that because the village has a way of ostracizing or basically of expelling people who do not imbibe the values of that village. That is what we know in many African communities. And if someone is perpetuating false information online, then our community can reject that person, refuse to share that information further. And one of the powers of misinformation or disinformation or even dangerous speech is virality. If we deny this conversation's virality, then many of them will be dead in their tracks. On one hand, we have to solve the problem. But on the other hand, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We have to keep watching out and making sure that every time there's a proposal by any government, focusing on Africa now, any African government that says we want to solve the problem of, hate speech or fake news, in quotes, as they said, we need to check the details. The devil is in the details. The area we need to focus on is in the details.
Thank you very much, Gbenga. I've noticed that we have another legal mind in our midst, Gabriela, who is a legal consultant on issues around transparency, open data, and technology and law. And I would like to include you in this conversation, Gabriela, and just find out from all of you, who you think should be responsible for content moderation? Gabriela, you can go first.
Oh, sorry to jump in. I put on my camera because I was thinking, which is probably the wrong time to put the camera on. No, I think with content moderation, though that's a specific element, I think it's interesting that we've been discussing democracy and not a lot about politics. And that's interesting to me, when we think about what democracy means and political participation and all these kinds of things, kind of shifts the focus. Having worked in the information space for a long time, I think, conversations on misinformation and disinformation are often distractions or can be misused. But I think that, part of the problem is from a platform perspective is that the incentives, you can ask them to do whatever they like to content. If you're thinking about content moderation on social media platforms, so you look at something like Twitter or Facebook, and we can see what they're doing now with flagging content. And that's interesting. But what we also see is that's absolutely not helpful because it's not really labeling that information isn't really the problem. Part of the problem is actually the structure of incentives. So how the platforms themselves through their feeds are incentivized to promote certain kinds of content because they work on a model that's based on advertising and attention. And that, unless we do something about that financial model, there's not really anything you can do to flag content or whatever, because it's like perversely opposite to what their goal is, which is to keep your attention. And the way to keep your attention is keep you irritated or, to keep you, in your echo chamber. Those are the two things. And so you get that thing that everybody talks about, which is, the polarizing of politics. You get that, but only really in the social, media space. And I think there's still a lot of classic work to be done on political participation in other forums where you can make progress. And I also think it's, interesting to think about then from the other side, the incentives on political parties and the role in the region that politics plays in misinformation and disinformation. That, say the Cambridge Analytica or whatever, they were hired by political parties here, in Kenya and South Africa to do their work. So there's still really traditional conversations to be had about participation in politics and participation in political parties that we shouldn't avoid, because that's really the bigger issue, and accountability of political parties, even as private entities, and how that feeds into all of this. There's really classic, politics discussions, I think, that make a lot of sense to think about in this space. So I've sort of drifted off on a tangent, but that's what I was thinking about.
Well, thank you so much for your reflections. Priya, your views around this?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Gabriela. I think that there is the potential to see the content as just information that could deceive and so on. And then there's another tier that Gbenga mentioned, which is examining the intent and where does that go. And I think where Gabriela was going is that this content has very powerful capabilities. It has the ability to influence decisions and outcomes that can change the geopolitical system that we know almost instantaneously. So this is very, very powerful when we look at when we look at it in totality. But at the same time, there's a huge recognition, I think, from many in the field that some of the efforts that we have been deploying so far have not been very successful. So if we think about some of the accountability mechanisms that we already have in place, the so-called, promises that are made by some of the tech providers on what can and can't be done. The sectoral self-regulatory type mechanisms that we rely extensively on. We think that through codes of conduct and codes of ethics, even the kinds of declarations that we have and models that we have, we're finding that they're not effective enough to influence change. And so we're left with a little bit of a dilemma. So if we start to reimagine it, and I liked what Gbenga said about trying to position, firstly the role of an army of digital activists, and Rabati, you mentioned, civic participation. So if we start to think about it in that way, that we have access to a larger group that takes forward messaging and understanding and awareness and so on. And if we think about villages as almost, nodal networks and carrying messages from person to person, and we shouldn't also make the assumption that meaningful decision-making can't happen at that level. So it isn't the case that an elite set, decides these are the rules and regulations. In fact, the participation and the decision-making within the nodes can change a number of things more sustainably and more meaningfully. So if we try to reimagine so-called regulation, and we try to think about how society itself and growing that civic participation becomes more meaningful in this context, we might move towards something that's a little more realistic and a little more powerful. Because as we say, we're left with this conundrum. Who knows where the solution is? But what we are doing so far doesn't seem to be working. So we could have campaigns and advocacy programs with millions, research documents and projects and so on. And what we're finding is that the proliferation of a harmful message just happens instantaneously and can reach millions in a minute. And, where do we stand with all our self-regulatory mechanisms and all our projects and all our research? So it is time to step out of that box and think of this as something that impacts society very deeply, but needs to involve society with the same level of depth.
Talking about solutions, I think we understand, or rather, most of us get to understand that we need to be part of the solution as citizens. We really need to make sure that our voices are being heard, that we participate. And so on that note, I would like us to perhaps start having conversations around what is it that we can do, particularly in the civic tech space. How do we use civic tech organizations to ensure that, we fight these threats to democracy? What are the actionable things that we can do to have this conversation, firstly, more broadly, and not just in pockets of communities? How do we get people more involved? How do civic tech organizations work with other organizations such as social enterprises, law organizations, to deal with some of these issues? Hlengiwe, your reflections? Is she not there? Okay, Pria, would you like to speak to this one?
I think I was on a train of thought, in the comments just before, and I think marrying some of those thinkings about how to broaden the inclusion of people who are the most affected, keeping in mind Hlengiwe's challenges she raised in terms of access to the internet, the divides that we see, not just the digital divide, but even the gender digital divide, the gendered digital divide, and so on. So within that context, I think we're going to have to almost experiment to try and work out what was successful when faced with similar human dilemmas in the past, because they have been successful strategies. And so when we came to this kind of crossroad for humanity, the consumption of something and the appeal of it is just overwhelming. So when we think about digital innovation now, and we think about things like artificial intelligence, health tech, and so on, there's an overwhelming appeal, and we can't ignore that. And that appeal is not just for everyone here. It's anyone who can access it is just drawn to it in some way. And then we realize that there are some consequences, and specifically for the democratic process and the way that we know it. So I think we are going to have to maybe examine historically when were we faced with similar dilemmas, and what proved successful when we needed to mobilize. So there are some successes that come to mind. So for instance, there was a lot of traction with things like facial recognition technology. And then there was some, serious pushback against that. And we've seen some kind of relaxation in that area. And that pushback came from society. It didn't come from the policy advocates. It is the people who suddenly started to feel uncomfortable. And we also, a few years ago, we saw some traction around other identity, technologies and innovations. And we similarly saw this level of discomfort from the population, and then some pushback. So I think we do have some lessons learned. We do have some cases where society was brought in, society was engaged on a particular issue, and ultimately, their perceptions and their views and their uptake of certain technology swung it in a specific way. So we do have some examples like that, and I think we can draw on that when we see that a line is being crossed, and that line that's being crossed has very negative consequences for democracy. So it's something that we just have to safeguard as we progress. There's very few people that are more excited about digital innovation, but at the same time, I think that I'm a serious advocate for a little bit of a net to protect, early adopters and so on.
Gbenga, your thoughts? Just thinking about the type of work that you do and training day, how we can use different mediums to educate, number one, and to highlight, to bring to the fore some of these issues. So using things like entertainment to not only entertain but to also educate, people.
Yes, I mean, apart from being able to use, popular culture or existing platforms, I think one area where we need to pay attention to, in terms of breaking down the jargon, is making, all of our conversation easier with local content. Now, I say this because, for example, Paradigm Initiative is on a 4-month radio tour discussing, right at the moment, across 28 states in Nigeria, discussing the social media bill proposed by the government, by the National Assembly, and why it's not a good idea. And, I've joined 2 of those radio sessions myself. And interesting enough, the conversations people are having, they're not exactly the kind of things we're worried about. So people are asking questions about the fines. I mean, we think people want, I don't want my rights, violated and things like that. But someone asked the question, if I'm supposed to pay 300,000 naira fine for doing something wrong, what if they are wrong and they pick me up by mistake? Where on earth would I get that kind of money from? And things like that. And it was very helpful. The first conversation we had was in Kano, in North, West Nigeria, which is, I mean, of course, the radio station could have used English, but they chose to use Hausa for the conversation. And there were so many things we didn't think of that began to bubble to the surface. issues that we didn't think were, major policy issues. The difference between, daughters and sons and how they relate to social media already. How the girl doesn't want to go online because she's worried about being harassed. And now she's hearing that you are further punishing people who are on that platform. So you're giving her a second reason to stay away. And the more she stays away, the less she's able to get opportunities, things like that. So we are spending a lot of time next year breaking down many of the materials we have. I mean, we have got content on, digital ID, surveillance, broadband, and all that, but breaking them down. On December 10th, for example, we're launching a digitalized toolkit called Ayeta. Ayeta, by the way, is a Yoruba word that means bulletproof vest. And the basic idea is a kind of protection that digital rights actors need to be able to do their work in case they get in harm's way. And the most interesting part of that project for me as we go towards December 10 is not the report we wrote. It is the gamification component. One of the people we're working with has been able to come up with a gaming environment that allows people to, yes, have fun, play games, but learn how to improve your practices. How do you improve your password game instead of using your husband or wife or girlfriend or boyfriend's or children's name and birthdays all the time? How do you learn all of those things? The other aspect that has been exciting for me is the illustrations. By the way, so this will be published, it's been translated into French and Swahili. And guess what? We didn't have to translate the illustrations. The illustrations are the same across languages. You look at the picture and you get the point. It tells you a story regardless of language. It's one of the reasons why music being a universal language has been very useful with citizen movements. You see people who don't speak the same language, protesting the same thing and singing the same song. They don't know. They can't, the person to the right and the person to the left, the old ants, they can't talk to each other, but they can speak through the language of something that is a common language to them. So I think we need to pay a lot more attention to converting our jargon into what is consumable, either in local languages or even in less jargon speak. And let me close with an example. We went for dinner, a few friends and I, of course, usual suspects, digitalized crowd. We went for dinner in Johannesburg at a very nice restaurant where there was supposed to be music and great food. But just before that, there was a woman who was supposed to make a presentation, just a short presentation. They do that every week, every month. They invite someone to come and make a quick presentation. She was supposed to make a presentation on zoonotic diseases. I mean, just something small before we have music and dinner. And then she started the presentations. First slide, second slide, third slide. By the 79th slide, I'm just kidding. But she went on, and she was passionate about it. But by the time she was done, we were bored. The music guys lost their mojo because they were not singing, they were singing off harmony, and the food was cold. And on our way out, we were making fun of the experience and saying, can you imagine? She was speaking jargon. We couldn't even hear, we didn't understand what zoonotic diseases meant. If only we had listened, maybe we'll understand a bit more about some of the things we're experiencing now. But, power of hindsight. And when we're making that joke, someone said, but that's exactly how you sound when you talk about digital rights. When you talk about human rights, that's exactly how you sound. People don't understand what you're saying. You're saying we need to get the perpetuation of the imperatives of all the dissuading issues. Nobody understands that. We need to break this down into what people understand, even if it's not in their local languages, but at least in a way they can connect with it. Because until people connect with issues that we're discussing, it will be like we are fighting for people who don't understand. And when push comes to shove, they will choose their convenience. Because government will scare them, they will choose their convenience over supporting you on the issues you're talking about. And by the way, I love what I heard earlier in terms of best practices. We look forward because one of the things we've learned on the continent, at least, is that countries copy each other. Algeria learns from Iran how to shut down and use, exams, student exams as an excuse. Ethiopia immediately copies from Algeria, and other countries are taking note and saying, one more thing to shut down for. Student exams, and things like that. But if we have also good news, I think there will be some sort of healthy rivalry, say between Ghana and Kenya, compete East Coast versus West Coast, who has the best records, because all of these countries, by the way, have digital strategies. You want to have a digital economy without promoting digital rights. I mean, it's like giving people food with poison. They will eat, but they will die.
Thank you very much. I mean, this has been a very insightful conversation, and I do think that it does require an expansion. I think we really do need to talk more to some of these issues. I see the comments are coming in. Thank you very much to everyone. Gabriella, just before we start wrapping up, I think Nati brought up the issue of weakened media institutions. The media or the news journalism plays a very big role in the advancement of democracy, and I think with the various social media platforms, for instance, Twitter, you go on Twitter and you can have an understanding of what the current affairs are and so on. But the journalism is becoming very lazy. And I think, again, because of the 24 news hour cycle, everybody wants to ensure that they're getting the clicks. People are going to their website, advertising, as one of you, Miriam, mentioned, to say advertising is also a big factor, because newspapers or these platforms are relying on advertisers, for funding and income and so on. So then the question is, what do we do to safeguard journalism and especially online?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult conversation, again, because a lot of it has to do with business models, and then you have to talk about threats from media's attempts to create in marketing and advertorial kind of activities, stay alive, but talking about, it's my, and so them trying to find alternative models for revenue is a really important conversation that we should all be participating and encouraging. And some of that involves creating new patterns of behavior, like encouraging people to pay for good content and good media, which is an education thing, and it's quite difficult to do. But it goes back to some of those classics of supporting, a lot of grassroots community journalism, which is still such a really important way for people to get information. And I think we underestimate that sometimes, particularly in communities which are rural and don't have access to, easy access to internet and stuff. Really,
Gabriella, your internet is letting us
which
down.
Helps. Oh, okay, don't worry.
Yeah.
Well,
I think a very interesting conversation. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our discussion, but I think one of the questions that we really ought to be asking ourselves is, what is the way forward now? What do we then do as civil society, as civic tech organizations, as NGOs, as law experts, in the social sort of like development space? What do we then need to do to ensure that we safeguard our democracies throughout the continent? We will be doing another poll now that we have had this conversation, to just see what our thoughts are, whether our minds have changed, from initially answering the question to, now that we have had the conversation, what our thoughts and reflections are on this. Melissa, would you kindly put the poll up for us so that we can see where we are? Is she there? Okay, just to give a short overview of some of the work we've been doing as CTIN, we've been very involved, as Geshi has posted on the chat, involved in Urban Fest, which was a great success. please have a look at the website and some of the reports from the month's festival. Okay, here is our poll. So it says, after this discussion, do you think in the next 10 years, do you see the world getting better or worse? Yes, meaning the world is getting better. No, the world is getting worse, or the two. Please do participate and let us have your thoughts before we end the conversation. Melissa will give us a heads up once everybody has submitted their answers, and we are now wrapping up. Any closing comments from you, Gbenga? Hlengiwe, I'm not sure if you are back. Pria, Gabriela, it would really be helpful to just have a summation of our conversation before we close off.
So thanks. I think my final words would be to throw the challenge I threw earlier again, to say that we will see increasingly complex challenges as technology continues to mature. It used to be that, you wanted to shut down the internet, you just shut it down. Right now, there are targeted shutdowns. There's throttling. There are more sophisticated ways of even targeting one individual. As that happens, we need to learn more. We need to up our game. We need to attract more resources, and we need to, change the game, basically. We cannot continue to do advocacy the way we've always done it. We have to change the game. And what I mean by changing the game is get more people who are our target audience anyway to understand what we're doing, so that they can also become our allies and our associates, and literally we can have more boots on the ground.
Thank you, Gbenga, for that. Pria?
I think for me, what dawns on me is that technology can also be powerful to this cause. So, so technology itself can be used to further democratization. And so, we might be speaking about civic tech networks, but maybe we should also be thinking about civic tech. So tech that is focused on civic outcomes. So some of the things that we heard Media Monitoring Africa is doing, and others, how can we use tech in a positive way to further democracy? And thank you again for the platform and for today's discussion.
Thank you for that, Pria. Gabi, your closing thoughts?
Founding a civic tech hubs. Oh, my connection, sorry, but it is about fostering conversations. So fostering new spaces for conversation all the time, and focusing on interrogation as a skill that we encourage in people. Empathy to political participation, that's the real problem. And so the alternatives are that, like civic education in schools, for instance, which is like a really low level but important activity, I think, to get different kinds of political conversations happening on our continent, and not getting too bogged down in, some of the digital and political hegemonies from the US and Europe that don't necessarily replicate here. So.
Okay, sorry, I tried sharing my screen so that we can all see the poll results. Ladies and gentlemen, you can see the results. So 36% of us think the world is getting better. 29% thinks no, it's getting worse. And the remaining 36% is sort of like neutral. I think it's important that we do not lose focus on what it is that we want to achieve. It is really important to continue doing the work, to continue to help others to feel more empowered, and all of that. I'd like to encourage you to please subscribe to our newsletter, which you will find on our website, civictech.africa. Follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter, where you will see updates around what we are doing, the various activities that we have lined up. Talking of activities and events, we have an event coming up in January that's going to speak to data and digitization, or rather data analytics, using data analytics and digitization to help social entrepreneurship. So please look out for that. I hope you have submitted your information on the spreadsheet that Ethan had kindly put together for us. Once again, thank you very much for participating in this conversation. It has really been interesting, you know, to just hear your thoughts and have this conversation. It's a very important conversation. Thank you very much, and goodbye to you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Our panelists, if you can please stay for 2 minutes, if you can. Okay. Thanks. Bye, everyone. Melissa, you can give us some music.
My people, open your eyes.